At 4:17 a.m. on May the 25th, 1942, in a windowless concrete room at the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific Headquarters in Honolulu, the war against Japan was being fought in silence. The sound of Morse code tapped endlessly across the static, and the smell of burnt dust from vacuum tubes hung in the air. Rows of men in khaki shirts bent over typewriters, deciphering fragments of intercepted Japanese messages that none of them could read. On the far wall, a blackboard covered in chalk numbers resembled the chaotic remains of a lost language. For 6 months, American intelligence had tried to unlock the code of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a cipher known as JN-25B. It was not words, but numbers, 5-digit groups, 33,000 of them changing every 24 hours. It was an alphabet of pure confusion, and every hour that passed without breaking it meant another convoy lost somewhere in the Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew they were blind. Japanese ships were moving across thousands of miles of ocean without being seen. Their carriers struck and vanished like ghosts. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore was gone. The rising sun stretched across the Pacific, and Washington could not explain how. In the code rooms of Pearl Harbor and Melbourne, analysts stared at meaningless strings of numbers and wondered if Japan had built the first unbreakable cipher in history. Somewhere in those messages lay the next attack, an operation referred to only by 2 letters, AF. No one knew what AF meant, only that Japanese fleets were converging on it. The pressure inside the radio unit was unbearable. Each morning brought new intercepts, thousands of digits-long broadcast from Tokyo Naval Headquarters to its fleets at Truk and the Marshalls. Teams of mathematicians, linguists, and cryptanalysts filled entire shifts copying, classifying, and counting symbols. They had found patterns repeated 5-digit groups suggesting that Japan was using an additive code system, but the key itself remained invisible. Every promising lead turned out to be noise. Every theory died under the weight of arithmetic. Men who had once been professors and engineers now sat in front of typewriters for 18 hours a day, praying for a single readable word. Outside, the Pacific slept under a gray dawn, but inside the room, the light never changed. Cigarette smoke drifted above the desks as teleprinters rattled out new intercepts faster than they could be analyzed. On the northern wall hung a map of the Pacific Ocean covered in red strings connecting unknown coordinates. One of them pointed directly toward a small atoll named Midway. Nimitz suspected that was the target, but suspicion was not proof. Until the code was broken, he could not risk the last of America's carriers. In that moment, the war hinged on a handful of minds and one impossible cipher. They had machines, punch cards, and calculating devices, yet no result. What none of them knew was that the first real clue would come not from a mathematician or a cryptanalyst, but from a woman sitting at a desk in the corner, a woman who wasn't supposed to read the messages she was typing. Her name did not appear on any roster of heroes, and her weapon was nothing more than a typewriter ribbon, frayed and stained with ink. But in the weeks to come, that ribbon would tear open the code that Japan believed could never be broken. If you believe that sometimes the smallest mistakes can change the course of history, type 1 in the comments right now. If you think no accident could ever shift a war, hit the like button instead. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next part of this story will show how a single woman turned a strip of ribbon into the most powerful intelligence weapon of the Pacific War. By the spring of 1942, Japan was winning not through brute force, but through mathematics. Every American defeat in the Pacific, from the sinking of the Houston to the fall of Corregidor, had been orchestrated through an invisible network of radio signals pulsing across the ocean. Japan's naval code, known as JN-25, was more than a cipher. It was a weapon of precision, planning a mathematical armor that shielded every move of the Imperial Navy from prying eyes. Each message began as a 5-digit number selected from a secret codebook of 33,000 entries. That number represented a word, a phrase, or a military concept aircraft carrier attack, refuel commence operation. Then each group was encrypted a second time with an additive key, a series of random numbers added and subtracted according to tables that changed weekly. Even if an enemy captured the code book without the key, the message remained gibberish. The men of the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific had been staring at that gibberish for half a year. Every day, operators at listening posts in Dutch Harbor, Guam, and Australia intercepted Japanese traffic and funneled it to Honolulu, where piles of teletype paper grew like drifts of snow. They logged more than 1,000 intercepted messages a week, most of them thousands of numbers long. Each time an analyst tried to find a pattern, the additive key shifted, breaking every clue. The work was excruciating. Cross-eyed from fatigue, they compared one column of digits to another, looking for microscopic repetitions that might expose the hidden structure beneath. Nothing stayed stable long enough to prove anything. The frustration spread through the command like a fever. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the eccentric head of the Honolulu unit, had begun sleeping in his office on a cot surrounded by dictionaries and ashtrays. He spoke in riddles and quotes from Shakespeare, but even he could not conjure progress. Washington sent more mathematicians. They made charts, formulas, and punch card sorters. None of it helped. "We are fighting an army of ghosts," Rochefort wrote in his diary. "We see their shadows in the ether, but never the men who send them." By May, intercepted traffic increased sharply. Entire squadrons of Japanese warships were on the move, converging on a location identified only by two letters AF. The coded designator had appeared dozens of times in dispatches. "Send supplies to AF." Air reconnaissance over AF scheduled for 1st June, Carrier Division 1 to rendezvous near AF. The analysts believed AF referred to Midway, a lonely atoll 200 miles northwest of Hawaii, America's last line of defense before the mainland. But intelligence could not act on belief. Nimitz demanded proof. Without it, the Pacific Fleet would have to guess where to fight. In Washington, cryptologists debated whether the code could even be broken before the war ended. The British had cracked the German enigma using machines. JN-25 defied machines. It was too vast, too fluid, and built on a logic of chaos. The analysts had almost given up when a small error changed everything. In one corner of the Honolulu operations room sat a row of typewriters used by clerical staff to retype intercepted numbers into clean copies for distribution. Among those clerks was a 24-year-old woman named Margaret Howard. She had joined the Navy as a typist, not a code breaker, and her job was considered purely administrative. Yet day after day she saw what others ignored, endless streams of numbers repeating sometimes perfectly, sometimes with subtle variations. Her typewriter's worn ribbon preserved those repetitions faintly in black and purple ink. She wasn't trained to understand them, but she felt their rhythm. To her, they looked like a pattern trying to speak. The men around her didn't notice her glances toward the paper as she typed, nor the quiet frown that creased her face when a particular sequence reappeared 5 digits, then the same 5 again separated by a handful of random characters. In that repetition lay a tiny flaw in Japan's armor, a mathematical heartbeat that would eventually betray the entire code. But for now, she was invisible, another uniform behind a desk, transcribing history she wasn't supposed to read. What made Japan's system so powerful was its belief in perfection. It relied on the assumption that human operators would never repeat the same additive key twice. But humans always do. Somewhere, a tired Japanese radio man had reused a line of the key by mistake. That single human slip created 2 nearly identical messages, one true, one distorted, and the faint echo of their difference appeared barely visible on Margaret's typewriter ribbon. The irony was unbearable. Months of supercomputing and mathematics had failed, but the answer had already passed under the ink of a secretary's hands. She did not yet know it, and neither did the officers who ignored her, but the Pacific's tide was about to shift because of a strip of fabric worth less than $1. If you've ever believed that wars are won only by admirals and generals, think again. Sometimes they're won by the people no one notices. Type 2 in the comments if you think small details decide great wars. If you disagree, hit the like button. And subscribe, because in the next part you'll see how one woman's torn typewriter ribbon became the key that unlocked Japan's greatest secret. She had arrived in Honolulu with no sense that history was waiting for her. Margaret Howard was 24, quiet and deliberate in the way people are when they know they are being watched. The Navy called her a clerical assistant, one of hundreds of women assigned to offices and typing pools after Pearl Harbor. Most were told they were supporting communications work. None were told that the messages they handled came directly from Japanese warships. She lived in a converted dormitory near Makiki Heights, rose before dawn, and walked the last mile to the base while the streets were still dark. The guards at the gate barely looked up as she passed. Women came and went by the hundreds, pushing paper through the machinery of war. Inside the Fleet Radio Unit building, the noise never stopped. Teletype machines hammered out intercepted transmissions from listening posts as far away as Guam and Dutch Harbor. The air vibrated with the drone of fans, keeping the decoding equipment from overheating. To Margaret, it smelled of ozone and carbon paper. Her job was simple: take the raw intercept sheets filled with 5-digit groups and retype them cleanly, spacing each group neatly so the analysts could read them without mistakes. She wasn't supposed to interpret, question, or think. Accuracy, not intelligence, was the rule, but even rules erode under repetition. She began noticing patterns after her second week. Certain groups of numbers returned again and again, not in the same order, but with uncanny regularity. Sometimes they differed by a single digit, as if someone had copied the same phrase but mistyped one key. To most of the analysts, these anomalies meant nothing. The Japanese traffic was enormous, and coincidences were expected. But Margaret had spent her pre-war years as a bookkeeper in Chicago. She knew the texture of numbers, the way repetition carried meaning. When she saw a pattern, she felt it. The more she typed, the more she noticed the rhythm. Her typewriter was an Underwood standard, its black ribbon worn thin by endless use. After hours of typing, faint ghost letters bled through from previous pages, leaving a palimpsest of digits just visible beneath the fresh ink. Once, when she replaced the ribbon, she saw those ghost patterns more clearly, the same 5-digit group printed twice, separated by only a few strokes. She held the ribbon to the light and realized that every time a sequence repeated, it left a darker shadow. To her, it looked like music notes repeating in a hidden melody. The men in the room saw none of it. They moved through their tasks with military precision, smoking and muttering, their attention fixed on mathematical tables. Margaret, the only woman in her section, knew better than to interrupt. She kept her discovery to herself, but began quietly marking the pages with a pencil, tiny dots beside recurring sequences, a private map of something she didn't yet understand. Her daily life followed the rhythm of the code room. 12-hour shifts, lunch from a tin tray eaten over a typewriter, letters from home censored and delayed. On Sundays, she washed her uniform in the communal sink and wrote in a notebook she never showed anyone. In those pages, she described her growing fascination with the numbers, the beauty of their structure. "It feels alive," she wrote once, "like the ocean tides. They change, but they repeat." One afternoon, a lieutenant stopped by her desk to drop another pile of intercepts. He glanced at the stack she had already finished and frowned. "Why are some of these marked?" he asked. Margaret hesitated. "They repeat, sir. I thought it might help." He shrugged, uninterested. "Don't waste time on patterns, Miss Howard. They don't mean anything unless the math says they do." He walked away before she could reply. The dismissal stung, but it didn't stop her. That night, when her shift ended, she stayed behind under the pretense of cleaning her machine. With the lights dimmed, she unspooled the typewriter ribbon again and stretched it between her fingers. The alternating impressions glimmered under the fluorescent hum numbers on numbers, echoes within echoes. It struck her that the patterns weren't random. They formed cycles. Every 12 lines the same clusters returned. It was as if the Japanese operators were using some hidden rhythm to their transmissions. She didn't yet know that what she was seeing was the repetition of additive keys, the mathematical flaw that would open the entire code. All she knew was that the repetition was real and that no one else had noticed. The next morning, she decided to keep the damaged ribbon rather than discard it. She wound it carefully into an envelope, marked it used, and tucked it into her drawer. Over the following days, she began to correlate her marks on the pages with the message's timestamps. When transmissions from Tokyo to Truk repeated the same numeric echoes appeared on her ribbon. She brought her observations to one of the younger analysts, a communications officer named Lieutenant Davis, who had a reputation for curiosity. It's probably nothing, she said, showing him the pages. But these groups, they line up. Davis studied them and frowned. Could be a coincidence, but maybe not. He promised to mention it to Commander Rochefort. Margaret returned to her desk, certain she had overstepped. Hours passed without response. Then, near midnight, Davis returned with the commander himself. Rochefort, rumpled and half awake, examined the marked pages and then the ribbon. His eyes narrowed. "You say this came from yesterday's intercept?" She nodded. He smiled slightly, the expression of a man who'd been searching for light in a tunnel and finally saw a spark. "Keep everything exactly as it is," he said. "Don't throw another ribbon away." That night, the woman who wasn't supposed to read the code became part of the team trying to break it. She didn't yet grasp the significance of what she had done. To her, it was only a rhythm she couldn't ignore. To Rochefort, it was the first tangible crack in an armor of numbers. If you've ever worked on something small and wondered whether it mattered, this is your moment to speak. Type 3 in the comments if you believe small hands can turn the course of great events. If you don't, hit like instead. And stay tuned, because in the next chapter, Margaret's torn ribbon will collide with a war that's running out of time. It happened on an ordinary morning, the kind of morning when the air inside the radio building felt heavier than the ocean outside. Margaret sat at her typewriter, retyping a new batch of intercepted signals marked Tokyo to Carrier Division 1. Her fingers moved on instinct 5 digits, space 5 digits return, until the rhythm suddenly broke. The typewriter jammed mid-line with a sharp metallic snap. She froze, lifted the platen, and saw the ribbon had torn straight through its center. The inked fabric dangled like a severed artery. She reached for a spare, but something about the tear stopped her. Along the frayed edge, faint mirror images of numbers glimmered where the ink had struck twice. Two sequences almost identical lay side by side, different by only a single digit in the middle. She held it closer to the light, and for the first time she saw the shape of the flaw. At first she thought it was a coincidence, another smudge from overuse. But when she looked at the original pages she had typed before the break, the same pattern appeared again, pairs of 5-digit groups repeating, offset by the same 1-digit difference. She pulled older copies from the filing stack pages she had finished days earlier and found the same rhythm echoing there too. The repetition wasn't random. It was mechanical, consistent, measured, almost musical. Margaret brought the torn ribbon to Lieutenant Davis. He studied it under his magnifier, muttering numbers to himself. 12-line interval, he said, always 12 apart. He compared it to the transmission log. Japanese stations rotated their frequencies every 12 hours. The math matched perfectly. "This can't be chance," he whispered. "They're reusing the same additive sequence." He turned to her. "Do you realize what this means?" She didn't. Not yet. To her it was still just a pattern, but Davis knew that repetition was death to any cipher. The Japanese code depended on randomness, each message encrypted with a unique key. If operators repeated one key even by accident, the two messages could be subtracted from each other, canceling out the encryption and revealing the underlying structure. And the proof of that repetition, the fatal echo, was now stretched across the fabric of a secretary's broken ribbon. Davis carried the ribbon straight to Commander Rochefort's office. The commander had been awake for 30 hours, running on coffee and stubborn will. When Davis laid the ribbon on his desk, he leaned forward silent for a long time. Then he laughed a dry, tired laugh that startled everyone in the room. "Gentlemen," he said, "we've been looking for a door. This may be the keyhole." He ordered a full copy of the affected intercepts and told his analysts to prepare differential tables for subtraction analysis. For the first time in months, the room stirred with energy. Margaret watched from her desk as mathematicians and linguists swarmed around the evidence she had stumbled upon. They cut strips of the ribbon and mounted them under glass, comparing the ghost imprints to newly printed intercepts. When they subtracted one sequence from another, patterns emerged, numerical residues that corresponded to fixed Japanese words, aircraft attack division. It wasn't full translation, but it was proof that JN-25 could bleed. The discovery traveled fast, whispered across the intelligence network from Honolulu to Washington. Skeptics in the capital dismissed it as luck. But luck in war was currency, and Rochefort was ready to spend it. He ordered his team to build a master table of repeated additive groups using Margaret's markings as a guide. They cataloged thousands of partial keys, slowly reconstructing the Japanese codebook one word at a time. Every night, Margaret typed their findings, aligning the numbers with precision born of obsession. She no longer felt like a clerk. She felt like part of something vast and dangerous. Days blurred into nights. The sound of typewriters and teleprinters merged into one continuous hum. Each discovery brought a new rush of adrenaline, each dead end another collapse into fatigue. Margaret rarely left the building. She slept on a cot in a side office, her dreams filled with numbers swimming like fish through water. When she awoke, she reached for the torn ribbon still folded carefully in her pocket. It was her proof that mistakes could matter. But not everyone welcomed her involvement. A senior analyst confronted Rochefort one afternoon. "You're basing operational intelligence on a clerk's observation," he said. "That's reckless." Rochefort replied, "Reckless is ignoring the truth because it came from the wrong person." He walked away before the argument could continue. From that moment, Margaret's ribbon became an object of quiet defiance, a reminder that war didn't care about rank or gender, only results. By the first week of June, their reconstructed tables began producing coherent fragments. One translated dispatch contained the phrase, "AF will run short of water." Rochefort suspected that AF was Midway, but Nimitz demanded confirmation. To prove it, Rochefort devised a test. He instructed the garrison on Midway to transmit an uncoded message reporting a breakdown in their water system. 2 days later, Tokyo sent an encrypted order stating that AF reports water shortage. The confirmation was absolute. The target was Midway, and Japan was walking into a trap. Margaret read the summary posted on the bulletin board the next morning. The room erupted in applause. Some of the men wept openly. She felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the thought that her accidental discovery had helped reveal Japan's next move. The torn ribbon, now sealed in an envelope marked evidence, rested in Rochefort's safe. When he passed her in the hallway, he stopped, gave a rare smile, and said, "Good work, Miss Howard. The Pacific owes you a drink." Outside, the sun blazed over Honolulu harbor. Carriers prepared to sail. The war that had once felt impossibly distant was now turning on the strength of one broken ribbon and the persistence of one woman who refused to throw it away. If you think accidents are only failures, think again. Type 4 in the comments if you believe that sometimes a single mistake can save thousands of lives. If not, hit the like button and make sure you subscribe, because the next part of this story will show how that torn ribbon led directly to the greatest ambush in naval history. The race began in silence. No one announced it, and no one left the building once it started. By June 1, 1942, the fleet radio unit in Honolulu had become a sealed world of paper smoke and numbers. Daylight vanished behind blackout curtains. Clocks lost meaning. The room smelled of ink and fatigue. Every desk overflowed with intercepted signals, thousands of them stacked in brittle towers that trembled when someone walked by. Each page represented a fragment of Japanese intent, and somewhere among those pages lay the timing and direction of the next blow. Rochefort's team divided into shifts 12 hours each overlapping, so that the work never stopped. At the center of it all sat the master additive table, the partial key Margaret's discovery had made possible. Analysts pinned translucent sheets over the grid, aligning repetitions and canceling out numbers like surgeons dissecting a tumor. The room buzzed with the scratch of pencils and the clatter of typewriter keys. Whenever a message resolved into even a few intelligible words, someone would shout, "Hold that pattern," and a small crowd would gather around to check the math. Margaret worked beside Lieutenant Davis, retyping decoded fragments into coherent lines. Her torn ribbon had been replaced, but she kept the original locked in her drawer, its edges still stained with ink and fingerprints. Around her, the tempo intensified. New intercepts arrived every hour, carried in from the Radio Shack still warm from the machine. Some were routine logistics, but others came from high command in Tokyo messages, marked with priority codes reserved for major fleet operations. The pieces began to fit together. AF, the mysterious target, now appeared in context with designators for Carrier Division 1 and Air Group 6. Phrases such as Operation MI and Main Body Rendezvous east of AF emerged, confirming that Japan's largest carrier force was on the move. The analysts compared them with weather reports and tide data. Everything pointed to an attack within the first week of June. The strain was visible on everyone's faces. Red eyes trembling, hands, voices gone hoarse from whispering numbers. Rochefort's uniform hung loose. He had stopped shaving. Yet beneath the exhaustion, there was purpose and almost religious certainty that they were finally ahead of the enemy. When one of the translators identified a sequence corresponding to Akagi, the flagship of Admiral Nagumo, the room erupted in cheers. For months, those 5 carriers had haunted Allied command like specters. Now, they had coordinates. Meanwhile, far across the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy was already in motion. 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, and more than 200 aircraft steamed eastward toward Midway. Their confidence was absolute. The code was unbreakable, their plans invisible. Nagumo's officers toasted the operation each night in the wardroom. None of them imagined that a group of overworked codebreakers in a humid basement already knew their schedule almost to the hour. On June the 3rd, Rochefort compiled his findings into a single report, Enemy Striking Force Approx. 4 carriers will approach Midway from northwest attack, dawn for June. The message went to Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. Nimitz read it twice, then once more in silence. He looked at his operations officer and said, "We'll be waiting for them." Orders flashed out across the Pacific. Carriers Enterprise Hornet and Yorktown turned toward Midway. Margaret watched the staff officers carry the report out of the room. She realized she had not stepped outside in 4 days. For a moment she felt weightless, detached from everything except the pulse of the machines. She thought about the ribbon, about how fragile the entire chain of discovery had been, a single human error on a Japanese transmitter, a torn strip of cloth on her typewriter, and now fleets of steel moving because of it. That night the team gathered for coffee in the hallway. No one spoke of victory. They knew how easily intelligence could be wrong. A single misread digit could send an entire armada into empty water. Still, they had done everything possible. Margaret sat with her cup staring at the floor. Davis broke the silence. "You realize," he said, "if this works, we'll never be allowed to talk about it." She nodded. "That's all right," she said, "as long as it works." Hours later, at 6:00 a.m. on June 4th, the first message came through from Midway. "Many planes heading your way, bearing 320 distance 150 miles. The Japanese had arrived exactly as predicted. The American carriers were already in position. While the radio room erupted in controlled chaos, Margaret kept typing updates, her fingers steady, despite the tremor in her chest. She wasn't on the bridge of a ship, but she could feel the battle unfolding across the ocean. Throughout that day, reports poured in first from Midway's airfields, then from carrier scouts. Enemy sighted. Attack launched. Hit on Akagi. Each line felt like an echo of the numbers she had once typed blindly. Now they carried meaning, each transmission a confirmation that the invisible war of codes had become a real one of fire and steel. When the message arrived that 4 Japanese carriers were burning, the room fell silent. No one shouted. No one moved. The enormity of it hung in the air. Rochefort removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "It's over," he said quietly. They walked right into it. Davis turned to Margaret. "Your ribbon did this," he whispered. She shook her head. "No," she said. "Theirs did." Outside, the city erupted with distant cheers as news spread through Pearl Harbor. Inside the code room, the team simply sat in the dim light, too tired to celebrate. For them, the victory was not thunder or glory, but a fragile sense of relief, the knowledge that for once the math had been on their side. When Margaret finally stepped outside that evening, the air smelled of salt and rain. She looked up at the Pacific sky, imagining the ships returning home. The war was far from over, but something fundamental had changed. Japan's advance had been broken, and the tide had turned all, because the perfect code had made one imperfect repetition, and one woman had been paying attention. If you believe that wars are decided long before the first shot is fired by people whose names never appear in the headlines, write 5 in the comments right now. If you think victory only belongs to those who pull the trigger, hit the like button instead. And subscribe, because in the next part, we'll see what happened after Midway, the silence, the secrecy, and the forgotten woman who cracked the uncrackable code. The morning after the battle, the Pacific was still burning. Columns of smoke rose from the wreckage of 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, each one a floating city consumed by its own fuel. From 1,000 miles away, Margaret and the others in Honolulu received the first decrypted battle reports. The language was brief: military and cold enemy, carrier force destroyed. Own losses: Yorktown damaged, now abandoned. Midway secure. No description could capture the magnitude of what had happened. In the span of 5 hours, Japan's invincible strike force had been annihilated. The same fleet that had leveled Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier was now gone broken by a handful of pilots and by a code book that had bled through a typewriter ribbon. In the code room, no one cheered. They just sat at their desks, reading the incoming signals as if afraid to believe them. Commander Rochefort paced silently, his face pale with exhaustion. For weeks he had lived on black coffee and instinct. Now, as confirmation came from every direction, radio intercepts, patrol reports, carrier transmissions, he exhaled for the first time in days. "They did it," he said softly. "Every last one of them." For the historians who would later study it, the Battle of Midway was a miracle of timing. The Japanese lost 248 aircraft, over 3,000 sailors, and 4 carriers' losses they would never recover. The United States lost 307 men and 1 carrier, Yorktown, but gained the strategic initiative that would carry it across the Pacific. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan was on the defensive. And it had all begun with intelligence, with the ability to see what the enemy thought invisible. Margaret read each after-action report as it arrived, typing the summaries that would go to Washington. The details were brutal deck fires, ammunition explosions, pilots trapped in cockpits. She imagined the noise, the smoke, the chaos, and then reminded herself that every death on those burning ships meant thousands saved elsewhere. The math of war was cruel, but this was the first time the numbers had favored them. Still, there was no celebration in Honolulu. The work continued because the war did. Even as the victory cables arrived, new intercepts poured in from Japanese bases, regrouping for counterattacks. Margaret typed through the night, her fingers stained with ink. When she looked up at dawn, the others were asleep at their desks, and the radio still hissed with static. The world had changed, but their room had not. That afternoon, Rochefort gathered his team for a brief meeting. He thanked them, but his tone was somber. "What we did here stays here," he said. "You will tell no one, no press, no family, no letters home. If anyone asks how we knew, you say we were lucky." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "History will have to wait for the truth." The victory at Midway was immediately classified. The decrypted messages, the additive tables, even the existence of the Honolulu Code Room, all sealed under naval secrecy. For Margaret, the silence was harder than the work. She had imagined foolishly that there might be a moment of acknowledgement, a medal, a line in a report, maybe even a handshake. Instead, she was told to destroy her notes. Rochefort himself locked the torn ribbon away in a safe labeled, "Operational Evidence Do Not Remove." She watched as it disappeared into darkness. Weeks later, newsreels in the theaters back home declared Midway a triumph of American courage and naval power. The headlines praised admirals, pilots, and the luck of the sea. No one mentioned codebreakers, and certainly not a woman in a typing pool. Margaret clipped one newspaper photo of the burning Japanese carriers and folded it into her journal. Beneath it she wrote, "Sometimes victory has no name." The strategic effect was immediate and irreversible. With 4 of its best carriers destroyed, Japan could no longer mount large-scale offensives. Its pilots, the elite veterans of Pearl Harbor, were gone. The United States, meanwhile, seized the initiative, building ships faster than Japan could sink them, pushing across the Central Pacific toward the Philippines. Every success that followed Guadalcanal Leyte Gulf, the Marianas traced its lineage back to the numbers cracked in Honolulu. The intelligence gathered at Midway became the blueprint for Allied code-breaking across the world, from U-boats in the Atlantic to German Enigma traffic in Europe. But for the people who had done the work, there was only quiet. Rochefort was transferred soon after his role in the victory, obscured by politics. Lieutenant Davis returned to Washington. Margaret remained in Honolulu until the end of 1943, still typing intercepts, still forbidden to speak of what she had seen. The war's machinery rolled on, swallowing her back into anonymity. Sometimes late at night she would pause between pages and glance at the empty drawer where the ribbon had once been. She wondered whether it still existed or if it had been discarded like every other expendable tool of war. To her, it wasn't just a strip of inked fabric. It was proof that perfection is an illusion, that even the mightiest empire can fall because someone somewhere hit the wrong key. In Washington, analysts began compiling the official record of Midway. The reports credited improved intelligence coordination, but the name of the woman who had first spotted the pattern never appeared. Her story, like the ribbon itself, vanished into the archives. For decades, the myth persisted that Midway was won by luck. No one asked where that luck came from. Years later, when the files were finally declassified, a historian noticed a single line in a faded memo from 1942. An observation by female clerical staff led to discovery of additive repetition in JN-25 traffic. There was no signature, no date, no photograph, just a faint trace like the ghost print of numbers on an old typewriter ribbon. If you believe that heroes are sometimes hidden behind silence, that victory often belongs to those history forgets, type 6 in the comments right now. If you think only the famous names matter, hit the like button. And subscribe, because in the next and final part, you'll see what became of Margaret after the war and how one woman who changed the course of history was almost erased by it. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the code room fell silent for the first time in 3 years. The teleprinters were switched off. The blackout curtains were pulled back, and sunlight spilled across desks stained with ink and cigarette burns. For Margaret Howard, the sound of quiet was almost unbearable. She sat at her typewriter, fingers poised, waiting for messages that would never come. Outside, Honolulu erupted in celebration, ships blasting horns, sailors flooding the streets, strangers dancing in the rain. Inside, she filed her last report and signed a non-disclosure oath that forbade her from ever speaking about what she had done. Then she took off her uniform, packed her notebooks, and went home. In Chicago, no one asked about the war in the Pacific. People wanted to forget. She found work as a secretary at an insurance firm, a job that required the same precision, the same endless typing, but none of the urgency. Her co-workers talked about ration cards and baseball. When she mentioned she had been stationed in Hawaii, they smiled politely, assuming she had been a nurse or a clerk. She let them believe it. To tell the truth was impossible. Even if she tried, it would have sounded absurd. How could she explain that she had helped turn the tide of the largest war in human history because a typewriter ribbon had torn in the right place? Years passed, the machines changed, and the world forgot the language of ciphers. She married a quiet man who worked in shipping, raised 2 children, and never spoke of her time in the Navy. On her dresser, she kept a single keepsake, an old Underwood typewriter key, polished smooth from years of touch. Sometimes, when the house was empty, she would type rows of meaningless numbers, listening to the sound they made, the same mechanical heartbeat she had once followed through nights of war. In 1960, she read in the newspaper that the Battle of Midway had been won through brilliant naval strategy and American luck. There was no mention of Honolulu's code breakers, no mention of Rochefort, and certainly no mention of her. She clipped the article and tucked it into a box marked 1942. Beneath it, she placed a photograph of a young woman in uniform, unsmiling, her eyes steady on the camera. The caption on the back read, "Fleet Radio Unit, Honolulu, classified." Decades later, after her husband's death, she moved into a small apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. By then, the war belonged to history books. Movies and documentaries told the story of Midway as a battle of aircraft and admirals. Sometimes she watched them late at night, whispering the corrections that no one would ever hear. "You're missing the real story," she'd murmur to the television. It wasn't luck. It was ink. In 1982, as the Navy declassified portions of the JN-25 files, an aging historian named John Tolman visited her. He had tracked down surviving members of the Honolulu unit and found her name buried in a personnel roster. She opened the door to find a man holding a stack of yellowed papers. "Mrs. Howard," he said, "I think you helped win the Battle of Midway." She smiled faintly. "I typed some numbers," she said. "That's all." He asked to record an interview. She refused. It was a team, she said, and the ribbons long gone. She died in 1989, age 71, without ever receiving official recognition. 3 years later, when additional records were released, her annotation marks appeared in the surviving intercept copies, small pencil dots beside repeated number groups, exactly as she had described in her notebooks. Naval historians finally acknowledged that those patterns had led to the discovery of additive key repetition, the first step toward breaking JN-25. By then, the woman who had seen the flaw was long gone. Today, her name appears only once in the archives on a faded duty roster, Howard M. Clerical Staff, Frupac, Honolulu. Next to it, someone had written a single word in pencil, "Retired." The original torn ribbon labeled Evidence Number 14 remains locked inside a climate-controlled vault at the National Cryptologic Museum. Visitors pass by without noticing, unaware that this strip of fabric changed the course of the Pacific War. History often remembers the men who gave the orders, not the women who gave them meaning. But somewhere in those ghostly imprints of ink, you can still see her fingerprints, the quiet proof that even the smallest act of attention can rewrite the world. If you believe that ordinary people can shape history even when no one remembers their names, write 7 in the comments right now. If you think history only belongs to those in the headlines, hit the like button. And if stories like this move you, Stories of courage hidden behind silence. Subscribe because this channel exists to keep their voices alive, one forgotten hero at a time.